Welcome to As I Live and Grieve, a podcast that tells the truth about how hard this is. We're glad you joined us today. We know how hard it is to lose someone you love and how well-intentioned friends and family try so hard to comfort us. We created this podcast to provide you with comfort, knowledge, and support. We are grief advocates, not professionals, not licensed therapists. We are you. Today we are speaking with Gary Roe again. Gary is a multiple award-winning author, speaker, and grief specialist. He's a compassionate and trusted voice in grief recovery who has been bringing comfort, hope, encouragement, and healing to hurting, wounded hearts for more than 30 years. Gary is the author of more than a dozen books, including the award-winning bestsellers Shattered, Surviving the Loss of a Child, Comfort for Grieving Hearts, Heartbroken, Healing from the Loss of a Spouse, and Teen Grief, Caring for the Grieving Teenage Heart. Gary has been featured on Dr. Laura, Wellness.com, BeliefNet, CBN, The Daily Positive, Thrive Global, and other major media, and has well over 700 grief-related articles in print. He's a popular keynote, conference, and seminar speaker at a wide variety of venues. A former college minister, missionary in Japan, entrepreneur in Hawaii, and pastor in Texas and Washington, Gary has served as a writer, speaker, chaplain, and grief counselor with Hospice Brazos Valley in Central Texas. Gary loves being a husband and father. He has 7 adopted children, including 3 daughters from Colombia. He enjoys hockey, corny jokes, good puns, and colorful Hawaiian shirts. Gary and his wife Jen and family live in Texas.
Good afternoon and welcome to As I Live and Grieve. Today our guest is Gary Roe. Gary's been with us before and we just love it when he comes back. Today, this is a particularly interesting topic and it coincides with the release of his new book, the Grief Guidebook. Common questions, compassionate answers, practical suggestions. So Gary, I'm just going to turn it over to you. Maybe you can give us a little snippet about your background again for those who may not have heard you before, and then just why this book and how is it set up? Anything you want us to know.
All right. Thank you, Kathy.
You're
well, that's a wide open door. It's really wide for me to walk through. Isn't it?
There are few people I would offer that to.
Well, I'm going to do my best. I won't use any puns or bad jokes or anything. Well, people ask me all the time. In fact, I recently moved about a month ago, and when people meet you for the first time, you know what they're going to ask.
Yeah, what do you do?
What do you do? And I hadn't really thought through that, this time. And after the first couple of days, I backed up and I thought through it. And so now my answer is, my job is not really a job. It's a calling. And it's the most amazing calling that I get to enter people's lives at some of the most vulnerable times in their life and walk with them through the grief of the loss of a loved one. Now that gets varied reactions when I do that.
I'm sure.
But automatically, if they don't know me at all, the next question is, how did you get into that, right? How did that happen? And so just putting this as briefly as I can, I really came from a background of loss. It began with sexual abuse in early childhood, a loss of a sense of innocence, a loss of a sense of a lot of things, actually, a loss of a sense of family, or at least functional family. Mm-hmm. Both my grandfathers died before I ever really knew who they were. One grandmother never knew who I was because of dementia. We lost a number of other family members before I got to the age of 10. My parents' marriage was not good. It was very volatile. And soon after, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but I lost a best friend at the age of 12 to spinal meningitis. And that's the first time I ever remember really asking the question, why? Why him? Why now? Why this?
Right.
Soon after that, my parents separated and divorced. That was another loss. Coming right after that was the loss of my childhood home, because I went with my mom by default and she sold that house. And then my mom, she had really been drifting into mental illness for a number of years, but none of us knew that. So she had a mental breakdown. I bounced over and lived with my dad for a while. My dad, he was great, lived with him for about 6 months. He had a heart attack and died in front of me when I was 15. Went back over to live with mom. She wasn't any better than before, made a suicide attempt. And I wound up not in official foster care, but another family. I was a competitive swimmer, and another swimming family just took me in the last 3 years of high school. And they had 4 kids, and it was just a wonderful experience for me. But my first 15 years kind of set the tone. I realized right away that life was going to be very, very, very hard. I was under no illusions that this was going to be smooth and that I wasn't going to get hit again. So I began to say, what can I do to heal from what's happened? And what can I also do to prepare myself for what's ahead so that I not only handle this stuff, but somehow am able to turn it around and use it for good for someone else. Now, I don't know where that thought came from. Now it's easy for me to say I think that thought came from God, because that thought does not come from a 15-year-old boy. Right. Anyway, I wish I could say my losses stopped there, but they did not. Many, many losses since, some of them so heavy as to be debilitating, right up to the fact that my older brother, my only sibling, died 2 weeks ago. So right up to the present moment, my life has been really a journey of grief.
It is.
It's kind of one grief wilderness after another with patches of green pasture in between.
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
And most of my adult life has been spent helping hurting people heal and grow. I was a college minister for a while, a missionary in Japan, a pastor for 20 plus years, was in hospice for a dozen years. And now I just, for lack of a better term, I run my own grief ministry, which involves grief coaching. It involves writing books. That's the biggest part of it. Right. And the second part would be speaking, and then grief coaching on a limited basis. So that's kind of my heartbeat, because the world is not kind to grieving hearts. And almost every issue we face in life is the result of a loss of some kind, even if it's not the physical death. Right. That's right. Of a loved one. And so I have this weird simplistic idea that if we could learn to grieve a little better, whatever loss there is, if we could learn to do that in a way that's loving toward ourselves and loving toward other people, wow, things could really be different for us, but potentially really different for the people we're around too, as we kind of live that out before them. So having said all that, this new book, the Grief Guidebook, most of my books are kind of written as conversations between, someone who is grieving and myself, along with some affirmations and maybe some suggestions, practical suggestions. And this book is kind of laid out in that format. But the difference is, I woke up one day and realized, I wonder how many questions over the last 35 plus years I have been asked about the grief process. And so I just started writing questions, kind of writing every question that I could remember. Of course, you can't remember them all, but anyway, right. This legal pad, 3, 4, 5 pages. And then I noticed, a lot of these questions are similar. They can they're not the same question, but you can kind of group them together. So I began grouping some together. And then I thought, what if I wrote a kind of guidebook for the grief process that covered the major common questions that I have heard from almost every grieving person, in some shape, form, or fashion. So I know it's a random number, but it got whittled down to 71 questions. So there's 71 questions that I deal with in the book. And then to kind of help people further, I break those down into categories of, this question is mainly about emotions. This question is mainly about the physical aspects of grief, physical symptoms that we're having. Right. These are mainly about the mental aspects or the spiritual aspects or our relationships and how wonky those can go while we're in the grieving process. Or the question is about the future somehow. So I arrange the questions like that, and each chapter begins with the question and begins with the grieving heart kind of expounding on that question a little bit, and then me having a conversation with the grieving heart, talking back to them about that question. And then the chapter ends with an affirmation about that issue, and also just some practical suggestions for how to handle that issue. And the different, I guess, this book being different from my others in the sense that most books you read from beginning to end, right? You start at the beginning and you just go all the way through. The Grief Guidebook certainly can be read that way, and it's very comprehensive. I think that's one word that reviewers are using, is comprehensive. It covers a lot of stuff.
Yes.
And so, if someone is a counselor or a social worker or a grief group facilitator, and they know their own grief, but they want a broader, comprehensive view of grief, this would be a great book for them. Plus, they can then they know how to deal with questions that are coming out, or at least how I dealt with the question. And for the reader, it's designed so that if they wanted to, they could go to whatever question they feel like they're dealing most with that day. Or maybe they go out and have coffee with somebody and they find 4 questions in the book that they dealt with during that one conversation.
Right.
So it's designed to be intensely practical. It's also designed to, as much as possible, meet people where they are in their grief. And as I say, kind of normalize that grief, because we all feel weird. We wonder if anybody else has ever felt this. Has anybody else ever thought this? I feel so alone here. And there's a part of our hearts that really wants to grieve and grieve well. And that part can lead us to wanting to be alone, actually, to kind of rest in that a little bit. And that's just fine as long as we don't stay there. But anyway, that's kind of what the book is about.
Well, I think of the many, and I certainly haven't read all, but of the many books that I have leafed through, looked at that are about grief, I have to say this one has immediately jumped to the top of my list. And I certainly haven't covered it all. But lest our listeners just think, okay, so it's a question and then it's an answer and then it's an affirmation. It's not. The words that Gary uses have a very tender, compassionate tone. Yet at the same time, the questions have those words that we all have in our hearts and on our minds, those words that really just make us want to sit there and cry. For example, I wasn't going to do this till later, but I have to. For example, this is chapter 24. What happened to my focus and concentration? And it starts out, my thoughts are scattered. I get distracted so easily. I can't focus or concentrate like I used to. I'm worried and frightened about this. Is something wrong with me?
That's a great one.
It's great, but it's exactly how you might feel.
Yeah.
Simple words, nothing complex, but very, very real emotions. And the question, is something wrong with me? And I would imagine a lot of people have asked that. What's wrong with me? Why do I cry so much? Why can't I get past this? And so, Gary, your answer for that question might include things like,
now I'm going to have to go to that chapter.
No, if I said to you, is something wrong with me? I'm crying all the time.
Oh, my goodness. Well, of course, part of the answer is going to be, in a very nice way, join the club.
Exactly.
I mean, we're all there, or we have been there,
Right.
because we have this idea that grief is simpler than it is. It's very complex. It's also very simple. You can deal with it very simply just by finding healthy ways to express it over time with other people and alone. And if we focus on that, a whole lot gets solved. Just solved. Well, anyway,
Resolved.
Resolved by that. We grow and we heal and we adjust through that.
Right.
We'll never be the same people again, and we're not supposed to be.
Right.
But I really believe, no matter what the loss, and if you're listening today, just hear me out, because for some of you, this is going to be impossible to imagine. But I really believe that no matter what the loss, every grieving heart can heal. We don't go back to who we were, but we can heal, we can adjust, we can recover, we can grow, and we can actually live with more meaning and purpose than ever before. Part of that being figuring out ways to live a legacy that is honoring to our loved one and to live in a way that honors them. So, having said all that, boy, I went down a rabbit trail there. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay.
You
That's
know,
okay.
I wish, I wish I had a count of how many times someone has said to me something like, I feel crazy. Am I crazy? I feel like early onset dementia because I can't remember anything.
Right.
And we don't realize that grief just doesn't have emotional impact. It has mental impact.
It does.
It shrinks all of our abilities because grief is taking up more space now. So there's just not enough of us left. There's not enough of our brains left. There's not enough of our bodies left sometimes. And so there's illnesses or fatigue or exhaustion. And all of these things, as we all know, work together to produce this ball of, I am so not at my best right now.
Right.
And I am limited, therefore, in my ability to focus and concentrate, which can be scary, not just from a health standpoint, but if you've got a job that really demands
Right.
intense focus and concentration.
Absolutely.
And especially if perchance other people's livelihoods depend on your performance or other people's lives depend on your performance. And so just knowing, I mean, the first step in the battle is just knowing, okay, this is common in grief. Okay, other people experience this too. A lot of other people. In fact, so many people experience it, it wound up as a question in this book.
I was just going to say that, so many people have experienced it that it's in your book.
Mm-hmm.
This is also a book that you don't have to think about, all right, I haven't finished it yet. You can set it aside, really, and not look at it for weeks. You can just, before going to bed at one night, you can open it and flip to chapter 54. Why doesn't anyone talk about them? I'm frustrated and angry. No one mentions my loved one. No one even speaks their name. It's like they never even existed. Why doesn't anyone talk about them? And I know that many people don't talk about them because they think if they bring it up, it's going to make you feel sad.
Right. They don't want to upset
They think
you.
it has, exactly. They think it's become almost a forbidden topic. But if they only realized that to have someone mention a name, I like to try to do it in a memory. Oh, I remember this time. And that way you get to mention the name, you honor that person, and you honor the relationship that existed between that person in your memory and the person who's there with you. And that is one of the best. You can just see their faces light up.
Yeah, and it makes them smile. And it could be a memory that maybe they haven't thought about in a long time. Or sometimes it might have been something that they didn't even realize happened. And they'll go, oh, and it just brings a little bit of light back into their life.
Yep. So I try to do that with anybody I know that has suffered a loss. Oh, gosh, even years. Sometimes there's that lull in the conversation and you don't know what to say. Well, think of a memory and bring it into the conversation and you will have a smiling face. Maybe teary eyes, but a very happy smiling face.
Yes. What a great idea.
Yeah.
And the power in a person's name is extraordinary.
Absolutely.
It's just extraordinary. We have this idea that we can make people feel something. And I think sometimes we just need to realize that people who are grieving, the grief is inside them. I mean, it's looking for a way out.
Right.
And we can best support other grieving people when we just walk with them in their stuff and just walk with them, do a lot of listening, maybe ask a few questions, and just let the grief come out. Let them express it in a safe environment like that. That's just huge.
Absolutely.
When people tell me, when somebody shares something with me online in an email. And it sounds particularly lonely. Okay. One of my responses back is inevitably, do you have anyone where you are that is trustworthy, that you can share with freely without fear of judgment?
Right.
We all need people like that. Do you have anybody like that? And it's just so sad to me when a person says, no, I don't.
Right.
No, I don't. And that could be for any number of reasons.
Sure.
But until we have that in our lives, I mean, that's going to be huge in our recovery. A big part of the book, of course, is about our relationships, because loss changes us.
Right.
It automatically changes our relationships too.
Right.
We think other people are being weird. Well, they are. They are. They are. But they think we're being weird.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we're changing, and they sense that. And this is why I think if everybody, sometimes I think we need a big grief awareness training, and everybody on the planet is required to attend.
Yep.
And they actually listened, because people are so uncomfortable around emotions and around somebody who's grieving.
That's right.
That they will just do anything. Will do anything to avoid pain, another person's pain, our pain, when in reality, that's when we need each other the most.
Right.
Absolutely.
To just walk through that together.
Absolutely. We have talked a few times in our podcast about how generations ago, when someone in your family died, first of all, the family themselves prepared the body for viewing. The body was set in a coffin in your parlor or somewhere in your house. Your house was draped with bunting, and the color of the bunting would vary depending on whether it was a parent, a child, a sibling, a grandparent, or something like that. The bunting would be different colors. The family wore certain clothing or armbands for most of the men, and they wore it for a period of time. So it was obvious to everyone in the community that this person or this family was grieving a loss. Well, I think, my opinion only, with the advent of funeral directors and the practice being moving things to a funeral home, that there was, the bunting disappeared and the traditional clothing finally disappeared and everything got centralized to the funeral home. So now we don't know when someone's grieving. I almost some days want to wear a t-shirt when I go to Walmart that says, I'm grieving, how about you? Or something like that, just to start a conversation. That if you knew who was grieving, it would be so natural at times to reach out to them, to just say, oh, tell me about the person you lost, or whatever. And it might make conversation a little bit easier again. So we can't have international grief awareness training mandated. I mean, we couldn't even get a virus mandated, a vaccination mandated, right? But and not to make light of it, but if there was only a way to know who was grieving, I really think conversation might be a little easier. But instead, it's been stuffed. It's been put in a closet or down in the basement or in the locker at the train station or somewhere. And it has become a topic that's very uncomfortable for so many people.
You know how you've seen those sayings where it says, you don't know what someone else is going through, so be kind always. And I think that holds true. I think there are so many people grieving, whether it be from losing a loved one or, like we've talked about before, it could be a pet, it could be losing your dream job, it could be, so many other things. I think that it just goes back to that, be kind always, because you don't know what everybody has going on. And to be honest, everybody's got something going on.
Oh, sure.
And I just feel like everybody's has some sort of grief. Everybody has some sort of something happening in their life,
Right.
So it just needs to be a change in everybody's mindset, I think.
Right. And I go back to Dr. Bill Webster, who was one of our first guests, and he gave this very simple definition of grief. He said, grief is simply a normal reaction to an unwelcome event.
Mm-hmm.
That's grief in its simplest form, whatever the event is, and it's very, very true. And we've established also that grief is unique for everyone.
Right.
It's like your fingerprint. No two people suffer identically, and that grief could feasibly last for the rest of your life. Mm-hmm. I know I will grieve my husband for the rest of my life. It certainly has already changed shape and form. Mm-hmm. I've become a different person because of it. This podcast is one of the results, I think, from my grief. And I love doing this podcast, but it could last for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. But you learn to continue. I called it redefining myself after his death. I had to find out who I was again, because pretty much during his illness, I had given up everything I had. Right. I had given up all of my hobbies. I had given up any extra time, any extracurricular activities, so to speak. I didn't read anymore. I never watched TV. I didn't do anything except take care of him. So I became his caretaker, period. And I lost my identity. So I had to redefine myself. And I'm still working on it. So I'm kind of growing up a second time in my life. But
oh, wait a minute. Only a second time?
Well, all right. Well, we won't go through everything, but I do have a whole wing at the train station reserved with lockers. But anyway.
I think we all have several instances where we have to kind of grow up again.
We do. But so much depends on your attitude and the way you approach it.
Right.
And the people you have in your camp.
Right.
That can kind of help you, that you can admit, I'm having a really rotten day today.
Right.
Yes.
And they're just there, and they're there for you. Yeah.
You mentioned the T-shirt, Kathy.
Yeah.
It's been months, actually it was pre-COVID. I was making my hospice chaplain rounds in one of the nursing homes. And there is a lady coming toward me, and she has this shirt on, and it stopped me just right in my tracks. It says, "I am not a widow. My husband just happens to live in heaven."
Oh, I love that.
And she saw me looking at the shirt, and she just broke out in this big smile, and I said, "I love your shirt." And she walked over and hugged me, and then she said, "And the thing I like about it the best is it's true."
Uh-huh. Yep.
And we could say technically, yes, she is a widow, but we all know what she meant by that.
Right. Absolutely.
And that is, you don't stop being married when that happens. No. And anyway, but I love that. I thought I loved it because she was letting people know,
right?
Yes.
In her own way. And she was sharing about her husband at the same time.
That's really nice.
It was good.
Yeah, I like that. So, Gary, we've rambled a little bit. It's all been on the topic of grief and healing and everything. Your book just came out, and I think mine, I could still smell the ink on the pages, which I love. But, I strongly encourage people to grab a copy and just sit with it and let it resonate. It's so, so good. You have something else coming down the pipe?
Oh, you're so funny.
I'm always asking.
One last thing. I really wrote this, and this, Kat, just from looking, it's really a reference manual.
Yes.
In many ways, you can read it through, but we all know about grief. It comes, it stays, but it does this. Right. And the frustrating thing is we deal with the same questions over and over and over and
Absolutely.
over.
Right. Absolutely.
So to not be shy about going right back to the same chapter and not saying, well, I read that already, because I guarantee you will get something totally different.
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
It just happens.
Even a year or two down the road, read it again, and you can probably even reflect on the difference in your life.
Yes.
Yes. At the time.
And be encouraged.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. That, wow, I'm not quite as much of a mess right now as I thought I was.
Exactly. Yeah. It can't help but make you feel a little bit better.
Yes.
Well, for one thing, it starts you thinking, which generally will distract you from what was perseverating in your mind. Mm-hmm. It'll start you thinking in a different view, which is always a good thing when you're grieving, to have something you can think about and let it go through your mind.
Mm-hmm.
I really think anyone who facilitates a bereavement group should have a copy of this book and keep it handy. If during your group you hit one of those moments where nobody wants to talk about anything, you can open to a chapter, read it, read the question, and then have your group respond. It's a good way to bring things back to a state of interactivity in a group.
What a great idea. I wish I had had that in some of the groups
Well,
I facilitated.
but you have it now.
I have it now, don't I?
Yeah,
I have no more excuses.
Yeah, it's and I can't say enough about the words in the book. I'm a writer also, so words are very important to me, and the tone of a book is extremely important to me. And you don't want a book that sounds like a college textbook. That's not going to help me heal at all. I want a book that is either going to give me goosebumps, bring a tear to my eye, or make me feel something. And so far, every single page in this book that I have read has done just that. So, Gary, kudos on what I think, and I haven't read all of them, but so far is your best book ever. And I truly, truly love this book and find it invaluable.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So in answer to your question, is there anything else being worked on?
Yes,
there's
please.
always something being worked on. Simply because there's always needs out there that, and I discover more all the time. And things I've never thought about. People write me and say, would you please write something on? And I honestly write back and say, I've never thought about that before.
Exactly.
Because anyway, there will be 2 more books coming out this year if all goes well.
Yeah.
One of them is going to be my first workbook / journal. It is called Grieving the Right Way.
Okay.
WRITE.
Okay.
And it kind of covers, again, it's fairly comprehensive. It's got, well, anyway, that's enough for now.
Thanks.
Just a teaser, everyone.
Just a teaser.
The tough part about it was a balanced approach to the book that I felt would meet the needs of someone who's never journaled a page in their life, but also someone who is an experienced journaler, that they could dive into that and get just as much or more out of it, I think, than the person who's never journaled before. So look for that one, later this summer, early fall. And then sometime around probably early November or October, I have a series of books. There's only 2 so far, the God in Grief series, Grief Walk and Widowed Walk. The next book is going to be for those who have lost a child. The subtitle will be Experiencing God After the Loss of a Child. It'll be a devotional guide of about 150 readings. We don't know what the title's going to be yet because, and this is frustrating for people who have lost a child, there's a name for almost everybody else. But there's some names in other cultures, but if you just throw them out there, we English speakers don't have any idea what anybody's talking about. So we're throwing around several different options for what this book is actually going to be titled, to let people know clearly from the title what it's about. Excited about both these books, and sad that I'm excited because I just, at the same time, there's just such a need, I just wish it wasn't needed, but it is.
It definitely is. And as I said before we even started the podcast today, you are welcome on our podcast anytime. I love it when you send us a quick note and tell us you've got a book releasing. Now you've mentioned the journaling one, so I know we've got an episode for you.
He'll be back.
So, listeners, Gary will be back. Gary, is there anything else you want to tell our listeners before we wrap up?
Well, I know you hear stuff like this all the time, but I just want to say it today, is that you are not alone, but you will feel like you are. You're not crazy, but you will feel like you are sometimes. And you will get through this, although there's times when you really wonder if that's even possible. So please be kind to yourself and patient with yourself, and do your best to grieve and express your grief in healthy ways and connect with some good, healthy people who know grief. That will go a long way.
Thank you, Gary. Those are great words. So again, the name of his book is The Grief Guidebook, Common Questions, Compassionate Answers, Practical Suggestions. His name is Gary Roe. He's got lots of books out there. Any one of them is perfect for what you need to hear. And I encourage you to go look at your bookstore. And once you've read it, pass it on to someone else. You know who needs it. They may not know yet, but you know who needs it. So to our listeners, thanks for tuning in again. We love our podcast and bringing it to you and releasing a new episode every week. So until then, remember to take care of yourselves, and we'll be with you as we all continue to live and grieve. Thanks.
Thank you so much for listening with us today. Do you have a topic that you'd like us to cover, or do you have a question from one of our episodes? Please email us at info@asiliveinGrieve.com and let us know. We hope you will find a moment to leave a review, send an email, and share with others. Join us next time as we continue to live and grieve together.